Hi, everybody. Chad here. If you'd like to help me wake up the world one podcast at a time, you can find me on Patreon. And you can also look me up on the interwebs on TikTok and Instagram under the Gnostic Astronauts podcast. And if you want to hang out with me on the platform formerly known as Twitter, you can find me under Chad Atkins 2341. Thanks for tuning in, and get ready to open your mind. Eric Hecker is a former Raytheon employee who spent an entire year at Antarctica's South Pole Station. And while he was down there, he accidentally bumped into forbidden technology and discovered that the world may be run by mad scientists.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
Man, we're containers, and that's how supposedly the aliens look at us. It would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, a new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
On the morning of September 12th, 1933 in London, England, there was a guy waiting at a stoplight pondering a problem. And this was not just any guy. This was a pissed-off physicist. He had just read a newspaper article which covered a speech from the world's top experimental physicist, Ernest Rutherford. And in this speech, he had dismissed the idea of ever releasing useful energy from the atom. And he put it this way: any talk of extracting energy from atoms is moonshine. Now, moonshine is not a scientific term. It's what we would call nowadays as casting shade or dissing. It means nonsense, fantasy, or not real science. And this made his fellow physicists blood boil, because when the most respected nuclear physicist in the world says something is impossible, it discourages the entire field, which means he saw that a door was closing on an idea. And if he couldn't solve this problem himself, that door would soon be closed shut. And so, while he was waiting at that stoplight, he had an idea. And his idea was when a neutron hits a big atom, the atom can break apart. When it breaks, it releases energy and more neutrons. And this new neutron can split more atoms. This means one neutron can cause several atoms to split, which can create a chain reaction and can release a ton of energy. And then the light turned green. He crossed the street, went to his office, and wrote down his epiphany, which would eventually start a chain reaction in his life and the entire planet that would get way out of his control. And this guy's name was Leo Szilard, a Hungarian-born physicist. So Leo got to work, only shared the idea with colleagues, and by 1934, he had filed a patent for it. And he filed it under military secrecy. That means the patent was classified. He was trying to keep this idea hidden because he realized what it could be used for. Now, most of his colleagues didn't think it would work. They believed that neutrons couldn't cause enough reactions to multiply. But Leo kept pushing the idea because he was sure that the math made sense. And as things really started to heat up in Europe in the late 30s, he became concerned that the Germans may discover this idea too. So he wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And in this letter, he warned him that nuclear chain reactions were now possible. At the time, Hitler had just invaded Poland, and Germany now controlled top physicists. And he said, if Germany understands fission, they could build a weapon of unimaginable power. So he said that the U.S. needs to act fast. They need to fund research, secure uranium supplies, and begin to work on nuclear chain reactions. And to drive this letter home, he was able to get Albert Einstein to sign it at the bottom. And so, Roosevelt listened to him. He authorized money to be given to these guys so that they could begin to research fission. And that was the seed of the future Manhattan Project, of which Leo was kind of a part of. He contributed to the Manhattan Project from Chicago, but he was always kept at an arm's length from the inner circle. And the reason was, Leo had these pesky things called morals and a conscience. He felt that the institution of secrecy needed to be abolished because he had a global mindset. I mean, really, just the same way he could see the chain reaction of atoms, he could see the chain reaction of the events that the US government and these secret scientists were enacting with the Manhattan Project. He felt that America shouldn't own nuclear secrets, that humanity should cooperate, and that nuclear power should be internationalized. Of course, during a war, that sounds insane. But really, I think that was coming from the fact that he could see the future. He could see the momentum that these decisions were going to create. And if you watch the movie Oppenheimer, you can see the struggle between Leo and the military. He didn't think they should use the bomb. Leo saw the danger of creating a closed secret elite class who control secret or forbidden technology. And on top of that, you have a group of people who ignore morality and conscience and have no care for the preservation of the human species or this very planet. You know, it kind of makes me wonder if this group of people are even human at all. Well, I'll save that for another day. But that right there is called a technocracy. Well, wait a minute. Does that mean our planet is now run by a technocracy? Because some think that our planet is actually run by a breakaway civilization, and that this breakaway civilization is actually a technocracy, and one that operates outside of government control. And they are not loyal to any one nation state. Heck, they're not even loyal to humanity. And I bet the very fact that the world is divided up into nations makes it even easier for them to hide. It's easier for us to imagine that it's a couple nations that are causing all the problems in the world. But it's harder to imagine a group behind the scenes doing it. But the question is, who is this group? It's been rumored for decades that there have been breakthroughs in science that have been withheld from humanity. And those rumors are from before and after the Manhattan Project. And they are about new forms of energy they've discovered. Free energy, where we would no longer have to rely on oil. And our entire economy is built on oil. And if it's true that they really have made technological breakthroughs in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that they haven't shared with us, the question is, what have they done with it? Well, I guess they've kept it to themselves. And I would assume that they use it for their own purposes. But do they also use it against us? And as humans, we can only comprehend things that we have context for in our minds. So if there are new inventions that we don't even have context for, could we even see them? Would we be able to recognize what they were? Like, imagine if you gave an iPhone to someone 2,000 years ago. They would have no idea what it was. In fact, it would mean nothing to them. To them, it would be useless. And then imagine, how long would it take you to explain to them how the iPhone works, how you can hear sound through it, and see the videos, For them to just vaguely understand what they are, like most of us, it would take you probably weeks or more. You would have to teach them about electricity, radio waves, the internet, satellites, tell them we've been into space. It would take a lot of work to get them up to speed contextually so their mind wouldn't think it was some type of demon. Now let's turn that back to us. What if these science and technological breakthroughs are something that we have no context for? Like motors with no working parts, exotic forms of energy, and even zero-point energy. What if they've discovered new elements or physics? And what about if they had weapons that we have no context for? You see, we're used to weapons that create blood and guts and explosions and destroy matter. But what if there were weapons that affected our minds? Weapons that could put voices in our head or affect our moods, making us happy or afraid. How could you even begin to explain to somebody how that could even be? Let alone that the average person has no understanding of consciousness and what it even is. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. That there's a breakaway civilization, that they have advanced technology that would blow our minds, and that they have weapons that they use against us that we have no context for. So in order to even attempt to understand this, we first have to get back to what is a technocracy. A technocracy is where engineers, scientists, and technical experts manage society. Decisions are made by objective knowledge, not morals, conscience, or any regard for cosmic law or humanity itself. And their resources are distributed by technical systems and not markets or governments. Many think that we're in a technocracy right now, with Silicon Valley and all the influence they have. Central banks are run by economists. Intelligence agencies and Department of Defense contractors run black budget programs. And now we've got algorithms that influence society to throw in the mix. In fact, I think it's pretty clear to me that we are a soft technocracy, at least. But the whole idea about this breakaway civilization being technocrats is that they do have technology that they haven't shared with us, and that it's ancient and or alien technology, stuff that we have no context for. And of course, the guys that would be in charge of this technology would be physicists, aerospace engineers, material scientists, system theorists, basically mad scientists. How many movies have we seen over the years where a mad scientist is trying to take over the world? Maybe that's a form of soft disclosure. But I think our problem may be that mad scientists have taken over the world. And maybe they've always been in control. And that's why we just can't seem to get our act together. It's like in the movie Austin Powers. Dr. Evil was plotting to try and take over the world. And Austin Powers had to step in and save the day so that that didn't happen. But in our reality, Dr. Evil may have already taken over the world. And we need Austin Power type archetypes to come in and liberate humanity.
Yeah, baby!
And this Dr. Evil type breakaway civilization hides technological breakthroughs so they can use it to their own advantage and more easily control the human race. All right, you get the idea. But they can only maintain that advantage if we don't understand what they have. Now, it may not be sharks with friggin' lasers, but then again, I wouldn't be surprised. But whatever it is, it has to be kept secret. That would be the highest priority. So in our modern times, with all of the knowledge in the world in our pockets, is there any way we can see imprints of this breakaway civilization on society? Because remember, these technocrats are mad scientists. So they will have physicists, remote sensing experts, finance and resource tracking specialists, aerospace engineers, cartographers, mathematicians, chemists, then it goes on and on. And that's what Eric Weinstein's been complaining about for the last 5 years. That he's running into all of these walls behind the scenes in science and academia. And in fact, he even said that Jeffrey Epstein is hanging around those walls in science and academia and the finance world. Guaranteed, Epstein is an agent of the breakaway civilization. He was probably like a doorman to let people in. And I think that's the real fear with this Epstein list, that it's going to lead directly to this breakaway civilization. And now, is there any way where we could see this breakaway civilization? Any way that we can see their imprints on the world or society? Well, one place to look is global science efforts. Any types of projects where the entire global science community came together to share and collect data. So the easiest one to think about is space. For some reason, everybody gets along in space. Everybody seems to play by the rules and even share and help each other out if they have to. So if this breakaway civilization does exist, they definitely have their hands all over the space program. In fact, they probably created it. Now, how about on Earth? Is there any place on Earth where everybody just seems to get along? Any place where there's no borders, no contested territory, and never even been a war? Well, you know, there is. And that place is Antarctica. Now, Antarctica has to be probably the strangest place on the planet. 98% of it is covered by ice, on average about 1.2 miles thick. That's enough to raise the sea levels 200 feet if it all melted. It's also the highest continent on Earth, and its elevation is kind of mind-bending. Its overall average elevation is 8,200 feet above sea level. So the big sheet of ice basically lifts the land. So the oxygen's thinner there, it's harder to breathe. And its size is bigger than Europe. And the oceans that surround Antarctica are some of the most dangerous parts of the ocean on the entire planet. The winds out there build up massive speeds, and the waves can be 65 feet or more in storms. And they have these strong westerly winds out there that are named after the latitude bands. They have the roaring 40s, 40 to 50 degrees south, the furious 50s, 50 to 60 degrees south, and the screaming 60s, 60 to 70 degrees south. Because there's no landmass to block these winds, they can circle the globe non-stop. And this can create some of the largest waves in the world. And that's why nobody lives there. There's around 5,000 people there in the summer, and about 1,000 or less over winter. So because it's so remote, so dangerous to get there, we only know whatever they allow us to know about Antarctica. It's almost like it's quarantined off from the rest of the planet. In fact, this past June, a 19-year-old American pilot made an emergency landing on Chile's King George Island in Antarctica. Well, he said it was an emergency landing, but he just so happened to be attempting to be the youngest person to fly solo to all 7 continents and to raise $1 million for cancer research while he was doing it. But when he landed, they were pissed. He was immediately detained by the Chilean authorities, who host research stations and military personnel. He was accused of violating Chile's aeronautic code and multiple international Antarctic access regulations. They claim that his actions posed safety risks to other flights and activated alert protocols. Oh, I bet he set alarms off. He was held at a remote, freezing base for weeks. He described his isolation as lonely and deteriorating for his health. But in August, a Chilean judge suspended the proceedings against him, and he was allowed to leave. He agreed to donate $30,000 to a Chilean children's cancer foundation, and he had to stay out of Chile for 3 years. No fines or imprisonment. But I think that goes to show you, they don't want anybody going down to Antarctica. And it really would be a great spot for the breakaway civilization technocrats to do whatever they want. Any type of experiments, or communication, or whatever. Now, we have supposedly only known that Antarctica has existed for the last 200 years. Now, the official story is that it was discovered by a Russian expedition in 1820. But there's also something strange about that, too. In the 1950s, there was a college professor named Charles Hapgood. During World War II, he worked for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, now known as the CIA. And after the war, he was a history professor at several colleges over the years. This guy was an open-minded and curious researcher. And in the 1950s, he was researching ancient maps for a book that he wanted to write. And one day, he came across the map that was discovered in Turkey in 1929. And this was a fragment of a 1513 world map, and it was drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. But the strange part about this map is that at the bottom of the map, it had something that looked like the coastline of Antarctica. But how could that possibly be? This was 300 years before it was officially discovered. And on this map, Piri Reis had written that he drew the map based on older source maps. So if this is true, it really throws a monkey wrench into our understanding of history. And so Charles had that map sent away to the U.S. Air Force Cartography Department. And in July of 1960, the U.S. Air Force wrote him a letter telling him what they thought about the map. And Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer said, "The claim that the lower part of the map portrays the Princess Martha coast of Antarctica is reasonable. And we find that this is the most logical and in all probability the correct interpretation of the map. The geographical detail shown in the lower part of the map agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. And this map indicates that the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. We have no idea how the data on this map can be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge in 1513. Well, there you have it. People on Earth knew about Antarctica before 1820. And just addressing that very question throws off world history. How could humans have known about Antarctica and its coastline before it was covered in ice, except that they were more technologically advanced than we are now? Or at least just as technologically advanced as we are. But only one of two things could have happened. Either it was accidentally lost through some type of catastrophe and then people forgot about it, or it was on purposely erased so people would forget about it. And to me, that shows me Antarctica is a no-go. And they even tried to erase it out of world history, too. And there's something else strange about that place. It was rumored that in World War II, the Nazis had a base in Antarctica, and that it was called New Schwabenland. But of course, the boring official narrative says, no, that wasn't true. They did go there to have a look around in the 30s, but that was it. But oddly enough, in December of 1946, the U.S. sent a Navy task force down there, and it was called Operation High Jump. It consisted of 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine. It had icebreakers, helicopters, seaplanes, and 4,700 Navy, Coast Guard, and scientists. And it was headed up by Rear Admiral Richard H. Byrd. And he was a famous polar explorer. And before 1946, he'd already been down there 4 times. Now, the entire mission was supposed to last around 8 or 9 months, but they ended up coming home early, after only 3 months. They said they had to cut it short because the weather was too harsh. But that's kind of strange. There's a lot of mystery around Operation High Jump. The fact that they took a fully loaded aircraft carrier and 4,700 personnel, that's more of an invasion force than an expedition. But that's just one more strange thing about Antarctica that just doesn't seem to add up. And then about 10 years later, in 1957, something was created called the International Geophysical Year. It ran from July 1st, 1957 to December 31st, 1958. And its mission was to coordinate worldwide research during a peak time in solar activity to better understand Earth's systems, oceans, atmosphere, glaciers, magnetic fields, and outer space. So you can imagine, if there are mad scientists, they're definitely involved in this. There was 67 nations involved, and about 60 to 70,000 scientists. At the time, it was the largest science project in history. They basically measured every single area of the Earth that they could through echo sounding, sonar, measuring the gravitational field of the Earth, all the way into the upper atmosphere. That was when Sputnik first went into space, the first satellite. And in January of 1958, they detected 2 donut-shaped zones of trapped charged particles around the Earth. James Van Allen confirmed this with Geiger counters, and that's why today it's called the Van Allen Belt. Even the Canadian radio engineer Wilbert Smith said that he was involved with the International Geophysical Year. And he told his friends that he was involved in helping them detect UFOs. Of course, there's no official documentation that that's true. But given the flying saucer explosion in the 1950s all across the world, it's only natural that they would be trying to figure out what's going on. And they also set up shop in Antarctica. About 12 countries set up research stations down there. And one of the most notable ones was the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, which gave scientists a permanent presence at the pole. And after 18 months, on December 31st, 1958, the International Geophysical Year was finished. And almost a year later, on the 1st of December, 1959, they signed something called the Antarctic Treaty. And this treaty is one of the most unusual documents that's ever been created. It declares Antarctica is a continent for peace and science only, and there are to be no military bases, no weapons testing, no nuclear explosions, and no nuclear waste storage. It is forever a demilitarized zone. Now, in the early 1900s, a bunch of countries had claimed land in Antarctica. The UK, Chile, Argentina, Norway, France. But under this treaty, every claim is placed on hold. No one can enforce or expand a claim, and no new claims are allowed. The rule is they have to share scientific information openly. You're not allowed to mine or extract resources from down there. And there's really nothing like it to compare to on Earth. And of course, people are suspicious that that treaty was created because they discovered something. So let's think about it. What could they have discovered that would cause all of the nations of the world to cooperate and work together and insist on no type of weapons or anything that could lead to war or disturbing the continent? Now, if you think about it, it is the perfect cover. Seriously, the International Geophysical Year in the late 50s, when tensions were at some of the highest points in history, with the Soviets and the US both possessing nuclear weapons, yet they somehow can collaborate, get along, and share scientific data? Now let's remember, if there is a breakaway civilization, in order for them to exist, they have to control geopolitics. They're not loyal to any nation states. So when all of the nation states suddenly get along, I'm suspicious. So I think that they did find something. The question is, what did they find? Well, some theories are that they may have discovered ancient ruins or lost civilization. If you think about it, Operation High Jump and the International Geophysical Year started large-scale mapping of Antarctica, especially with radar, seismic surveys, and deep ice drilling. Maybe they found something old, massive, or advanced technology. Another idea is that they detected non-human craft or bases. There are stories of during early flights and radar mapping in the 1940s and 50s that the U.S. military encountered high-speed craft, electromagnetic anomalies, and objects coming out of the ocean. If there's something down there more advanced than us, then that would be a good incentive for everybody to get along. And another theory is that they detected something geophysical that they don't want public, like some type of massive, unstable volcano system, magnetic anomalies, and indications of rapid crustal shift potential. That guy Charles Hapgood, who made the Piri-Reis map famous, was convinced and wrote a book about how Antarctica was located 2,000 to 3,000 miles farther north about 12,000 years ago. So being outside of the Antarctic Circle, it was lush with vegetation and large mammals. And then a catastrophic pole shift caused it to rapidly move to where it is right now, which caused a flash freeze. And so then that creates the thought, well, if that happened before, maybe it could happen again when the poles shift, which is right now. The poles are shifting right now. So that's my least favorite theory. But if that were true, it would make sense that they wouldn't want people snooping around down there, find out, and cause mass panic on the Earth. But no matter how you look at it, Antarctica is a strange place. And if you were a mad scientist, breakaway, Dr. Evil type civilization, and you wanted to monkey around with exotic technology that you didn't want anyone to know you had, then Antarctica would be the place to go. And this leads us to a Raytheon contractor who spent 366 days down at the South Pole Station. And that's the station that was first established in 1957 by the International Geophysical Year. And he gives a first-hand eyewitness account of what it's like to live in Antarctica and just exactly what he saw going on down there. Because I think that he has bumped into technology from this Dr. Evil breakaway civilization. And his name is Eric Hecker. He was originally from Long Island, New York, and he was a plumber, and he had his own plumbing and heating business. He said he'd worked for other companies for many years, and eventually he started his own business and decided to work for himself, which was all fine and dandy until a huge catastrophic global economic shutdown happened in 2008. And like so many others around the world, he was out of work and willing to work anywhere. And I mean anywhere. Because the only place he could find a job was in Antarctica, and it was with the Department of Defense company, Raytheon. Now, Eric was well aware of what Raytheon was all about, and he was not a fan. Out of high school, Eric had joined the Navy and was part of the submarine service for a short time. And because Raytheon is a Department of Defense contractor, like so many others, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Bell Labs, he realized that these companies, and Raytheon, their business model is death. Their target market is militaries, and their products are things to kill people. And the more products they sell, the more people die. So they literally profit off of death. So he was clearly not a fan. But this job was with Raytheon Polar Services. And it was a janitorial type contract where he had to maintain the scientific facilities and buildings that they had. So it sounds innocent enough. Building maintenance on a science lab. So, in November of 2010, Eric flew down to the South Pole Station. And his official role was a tradesman, a plumber/fireman. And those were some of the most important jobs at the facility. Because when you're in Antarctica, you are 8,000 feet at least above sea level, which means the oxygen's thinner, it's harder to breathe, and the average temperature at the South Pole Station is minus 46 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that's minus 56 degrees. So if anything goes wrong with the building, they're dead. And during the long, dark Antarctica winter, from April to September, there are no flights in or out of the place. So they're told, if something bad happens during the winter months, if somebody gets injured or sick, they are stuck there until spring. So Eric and his crew of tradesmen and chefs and kitchen staff kept all of these scientists alive. And the way he describes it, it almost sounds like they were on another planet, living in a space station. And with Eric's duties as a plumber/fireman, he had a key to every single spot in the facility. And for fire safety, they had to go all throughout the facility every single day and inspect anything that may cause a fire or weaken the facility. So now the question is, what exactly was going on at that facility? Well, the official story is that there is an ice cube neutrino observatory, and that's the flagship of the facility. Now, that's a building with a control room, labs, and a lot of power infrastructure. And the most important part about that building is what's underneath of it. Because underneath of it, scientists had melted 86 holes, nearly 2.5 kilometers deep. And to each hole, they lowered a cable holding dozens of spherical detectors called DOMs, digital optical modules. Each cable has 60 detectors, for a total of 5,160 detectors hanging deep in the ice. And once they were in position, the holes refroze and locked them in place. So now the question is, what are those 5,160 detectors trying to detect? Well, they are trying to detect something called neutrinos. That is a subatomic particle that's created during nuclear reactions like those in the sun or inside of stars. And they don't really interact with matter that much. Right now, billions of them are passing through our bodies every second. Well, I don't feel anything. So usually, neutrinos pass straight through the Earth without interacting. But on the odd occasion, a neutrino collides with a molecule, and having over 5,000 detectors in the Antarctica ice, which is clear ice. So the odd time that a neutrino actually hits a molecule, it creates a flash of blue light. And that flash is called Cherenkov light. And each sensor records when and how bright the flash is. And these sensors also trace the direction the neutrino came from. They estimate its energy, and they identify what type it was. And they take all of this data, and they turn it into a type of cosmic map to try and gain more understanding about the sun, supernovas, black holes, and just energy events in the universe. And that's not the only thing they're doing down there. They also have an astronomy and space observatory. They have telescopes that study the cosmos. The South Pole Station is actually over 9,000 feet above sea level. And the air is very clean and dry. And during their 6-month winter, it's continually night. And the things that they observe with that telescope are cosmic microwave background radiation, CMB for short, gamma ray bursts, and other high-energy cosmic phenomena. Well, that sounds innocent enough. Then some other things they do down there are climate and atmospheric research. They take continuous measurements of the ozone layer, greenhouse gases, UV radiation, atmospheric composition. They drill into the ice to get ancient climate records. And through this, they get insight into hundreds of thousands of years of Earth's climate. They also measure how the ice sheet moves down there, and continually measuring its thickness and density. They also study seismology and geophysics, which monitors earthquakes across the entire planet. And we'll be coming back to that earthquake part later. They also have medical and human research. They study how humans react to isolation, extreme cold, and low sunlight, and that could be useful for long space missions like trips to Mars. And now, the big question is, how the heck do they power all this? Well, they have a power plant building that houses 6 massive Caterpillar diesel generators. And of course, this runs 24/7, and it runs on anywhere 4 to all 6 of them, depending on the season. And together, these things produce enough electricity to run a small town or more. And Eric's job, along with the rest of the tradesmen and support staff, were to keep this place functioning and safe, because all of their lives depended on it. There was around 200 people in the summertime and about 50 in the winter. So in the wintertime, they just leave a skeleton crew down there to keep everything running so it doesn't freeze over. But the question is, what exactly are they keeping running? Now, what I've just explained is the official story. what they've told the public is supposed to be going on down there. Now, when Eric and his team first got there, they were told that they used to have an ELF system, but it was shut down and they didn't use it anymore. ELF stands for extremely low frequency. And Eric was familiar with these ELF waves from his time in the submarine service. These extremely low frequency waves penetrate deep into seawater, and this allows the military to send messages to submerged submarines without forcing them to surface. And these ELF transmitters are huge. They have miles of antenna wires spread in the ground. The lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength, which is why ELF signals can travel through hundreds of meters of water. Now, Eric said at the time, he was also aware of some of the other theoretical possibilities for these ELF systems. They could use them for a lot more things than just transmitting signals to submerged submarines. But they said they were off and didn't use it anymore, so I guess that's that. Until one day, Eric had to do some maintenance, and he needed to replace a pump. And of course, the safety protocol is to identify all of the circuits and make sure the one you're working on is not energized. And while he was identifying all of these circuits, he traced one back to the subpanel, and when he looked at the subpanel, he saw that there was a breaker labeled ELF, and that breaker was on. And he thought to himself, wait a minute, they said the ELF was off, and they didn't use it anymore. And then his thought was, oh, I knew it. Of course Raytheon would be up to something. So he went to his superior and told him that the ELF system was energized. And they told him not to worry about it and just to focus on his task. And so that's just what he did, because he had enough things to worry about down there anyways. Being a tradesman and a fireman, he saw how easy it would be for something to break, whether it's the generators or pumps to fail or just having the place catch on fire and blow up. They had many close calls over the year he was down there, and he was dealing with fear on a regular basis. And on top of that, they also had the feeling that their lives weren't that valuable to Raytheon. He said that their behavior made him believe that the company valued the mission over the people, data over safety, and secrecy over human well-being. Well, you know, that sounds like a bunch of technocrats to me. The data is the most important thing of all. Who cares about humanity? He said that they repeatedly threw him into situations that he had no training for. They would be sent into hazardous environments without the proper training or equipment, and there was minimal medical resources for remote, life-threatening scenarios. They were just numbers. If one of them died, they'd just bring down another one. And so, Eric made it through his 366 days in Antarctica. He left for home in November of 2011, and he went back to a more normal civilian life. But over the next 5 years or so, he noticed he started developing some health conditions. And he said that over the years, he began to have his former crewmates from the South Pole reach out to him. He said people were reaching out because they were in bad shape medically, and they wanted to know what his condition was. So over time, they started comparing notes. And after a while, they started to realize that they all shared very similar conditions, or really, the same condition. And these were more than just normal health issues. And they eventually realized the shared symptoms that they were having is what we would now describe today as Havana syndrome. Now, Havana syndrome is a name given to a set of medical symptoms that started showing up in US and Canadian diplomats in Cuba in around 2016. They started reporting things like sudden pressure or pain in the head, ringing or buzzing noises, dizziness and loss of balance, nausea, vision problems, trouble concentrating, fatigue, and some lingering neurological issues. And doctors found signs in some patients that looked more similar to concussions, even though they had no physical impact to the head. And now the leading practical theory is that Havana syndrome is caused by directed energy, or you could say directed energy weapons. That's how they thought the diplomats in Cuba got it, that they were aiming some type of directed energy weapon at these diplomats. But how would Eric and his crew have these symptoms? Was there something aimed at them? Well, it was probably something they worked on. At the South Pole Station, some of the antennas there operate with high-power microwave transmitters, designed to reach satellites that only pass overhead once a day. And then they had the Atmospheric Research Center, with high-powered transmitters and receivers. And then on top of that, you got the good old ice cube neutrino detector, which uses massive amounts of power equipment, cryogenics, and communications hardware. And as Eric and his old crew start comparing notes, they also started to open up about their time there and what they saw. You know, they say hindsight is always 20/20. And when he and his crew started looking at their time there through hindsight while comparing notes, and some people opening up about what they really know, they started to realize that they were part of not just science research, but something deeper, more secret, and illegal. That this was something that was not under the oversight of the government. And as they continued to put the pieces together, they realized that they were a part of a directed energy weapons platform. And what they were told and believed were purely scientific systems, like the ice cube. They were actually powerful directed energy systems, and that there were multiple energy weapons systems, and not just the neutrino detector, but the ELF, extremely low frequency transmitters. And according to Eric, parts of the system can be used to influence or trigger earthquakes. And that he was told by his crew and insiders who were in the know that the first time that they fired up the ice cube neutrino, or directed energy system, it caused a magnitude 6.3 earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand. Now that's something Eric remembers very well, because his crew was at the South Pole Station when it finally transitioned from construction phase to operational. So Eric was there when they fired it up for the first time in February of 2011. And he said that at that time was when the summer crew was going home for the winter. So the South Pole drops from about 280 people down to 50. And they all fly out of Antarctica to their connecting flights in Christchurch, New Zealand. So at the time, it was quite the commotion at the station, and they were trying to get in contact with people to make sure that everybody was okay. And little did Eric know that the very thing that caused the earthquake, he was actually there to take care of. Now, when he first learned about this, he was told that it was an accident. But in later years, he's now convinced that it was on purpose, which is a pretty crazy thought, that they may possess an earthquake machine. and have the potential to use it on whoever or wherever they want? So it may be that the ice cube neutrino detector isn't just for neutrinos, that the same hardware could theoretically detect, emit, or manipulate direct energy. Some sensors might operate in reverse, as emitters and not just receivers. So it's not just a passive neutrino detector, but it acts like a gigantic phased array transmitter, also known as direct energy weapon. But it also may have another purpose. Eric and his crew believe that it also may be a hub for monitoring and communicating with off-world craft, including ET vehicles, that's extraterrestrial, and human-engineered anti-gravity ships. They think that anti-gravity ships emit neutrinos as a byproduct of their propulsion system. And because it is a neutrino detector, if anyone is going to see it, it would be them. So that would make it an air traffic control center for space. And Eric said that he's come to learn that, yes, there are extraterrestrials, there are ET spacecraft, but the large majority of everything that's up there are human. That there is a secret space program. The humans have created off-world ships that can travel deep into space. And that is something that has been rumored for years. That they never stopped going to the moon, and that they made it to Mars in the 70s. Now that one is quite the rabbit hole to go down. But can you imagine that? Can you imagine if there is a vast space fleet? Because I can't. And I think it's hard to imagine it because that would mean the lie is so huge that there could be something that far beyond what we know, and humanity's been funding it. That's the real scandal. And you can see why this breakaway civilization doesn't want to be found out. Especially if we realize that all of this technology could have set us free from fossil fuels. And that we would also find out that scarcity is not a thing, that it's created on purpose, and that these fuckers have been behind it the entire time. So now, is there any evidence of the secret space program? Well, you know, there is. There's a guy named Gary McKinnon. He was a Scottish systems administrator and hacker between 2001 and 2002. And he just so happens to be behind one of the biggest military computer hacks of all time. He gained unauthorized access to nearly 100 computers belonging to the U.S. Department of Defense, NASA, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force. At the time, he was pretty bummed out about the state of the world, and he believed that they did have zero-point energy and exotic energy discoveries that they were hiding from humanity. So he started on a quest to find evidence for suppressed free energy technology and UFO cover-ups. And Gary stated that while inside a U.S. Army computer system, he found a list of U.S. spaceship names and a separate list of non-terrestrial officers, whatever that means. But he saw an Excel spreadsheet with 2 tabs. One tab was titled Non-Terrestrial Officers, which listed names and ranks. The other tab was Fleet-to-Fleet Transfers and Ship-to-Ship Transfers. The ship names were not like standard U.S. Navy vessels. There were names like USSS Eclipse and USSS Warden. And he assumed that the USSS stood for United States Spaceship. And he was also snooping around NASA computers at Johnson Space Center. They handle raw image data from satellites and space shuttle missions. And he saw high-definition photos of a cylindrical-shaped craft. Kinda sounds like the famous Tic Tac to me. He also said that when he was snooping around, he found a document discussing the reverse engineering technology recovered from non-terrestrial sources. So that's reverse engineering alien craft right there. And he said that he also found evidence for classified projects involving advanced propulsion and anti-gravity systems. But he eventually got caught, and the US government was pissed. They accused Gary of creating massive damage by deleting critical files. They said they had to shut down their computers for 24 hours, and they estimated the cost of tracking and fixing his breaches at close to $1 million. And the US sought for his extradition from the UK, which led to a long, high-profile legal battle that lasted 10 years. Gary faced up to 60 years in a US prison. But his UK lawyers argued that he had Asperger's syndrome and that his motivation was just simple, harmless curiosity, not terrorism, and they claimed extradition and potential US prison sentence would be inhumane. And then in 2012, the UK Home Secretary blocked the extradition on human rights grounds, and the US government accepted that decision, which is interesting because Gary was never tried in the court of law. His claims were never put under scrutiny, which kind of makes sense because if what Gary saw was actually true, they would never want to draw the world's attention to it by a high-profile court case. Now, if the South Pole Station is not only an ice cube neutrino detector, but it's a direct energy platform that could cause earthquakes, and it's also an air traffic control for the secret space program and monitoring off-world technology, you gotta think they would need some serious power. And are all those diesel generators enough? Because they were not only doing passive science. And when him and his crew took a closer look at the explanation, it didn't match the infrastructure. And he felt that the power draw at the station seemed far beyond what neutrino science requires. Eric also recalls seeing a green laser coming straight up out of the atmospheric research building, and he described it as significant and memorable. He remembers looking at it, and it wasn't just a flash, but it would be for minutes or longer at a time. And he found out that green lasers at that intensity are not cheap to run. They're power hogs. A sustained blast into the sky can eat up the kind of electricity that you'd expect from a small town. And Eric and his crew feel that they were getting power from somewhere other than their diesel generators, that they are somehow connected to some form of exotic energy. So he is convinced that there's another power source that they were not aware of, possibly something they were tapped into under the ice. And I've heard one theory that's kind of cool, that there are caverns under the ice that connect to the ocean, and that there could be a nuclear submarine underneath the Ice Cube Neutrino Lab, and that it's tapped into it. That sounds pretty crazy. Other theories are that they have some type of exotic powered fission device under there. But my favorite one, and the one that if I had to bet on it, I would bet on this one, is that they are tapped into some type of exotic Earth energy. Something ancient. Maybe what the Nazis were looking all over the Earth for in the 30s. Remember, they did go to Antarctica. Whether they had a base or not, that can be argued. But they did create New Schwabenland. And the US did snatch up all the smart scientists in Operation Paperclip And then they did make a huge excursion to Antarctica after the war, Operation High Jump, in 1946. And then 10 years later, they start the International Geophysical Year and map the entire Earth and Antarctica in every way scientifically possible. And then they set up stations all over Antarctica, including this South Pole station. And I mean, really, when you look at it from that perspective, it has breakaway civilization written all over it. Now, let's look at what we've learned so far. That the ice cube neutrino detector may also be a direct energy weapon and has the ability to focus energy, possibly anywhere on Earth, and cause earthquakes. And it may also be used for tracking ET and human spaceships, potentially from the secret space program, above the Earth, and even out into deep space. And with everything that Eric's discovered, I've saved the worst for last, because this has to do with the ELF system. Remember when Eric accidentally discovered that the ELF system was energized and the breaker was on? Well, he's discovered that this ELF system can not only travel through the earth, ocean, and ice, and is not only used to communicate with submarines that are submerged deep in the ocean, but he says that these ELF signals can interact with our brain, and that they can tune into frequencies that can influence human behavior, that it can interface with the nervous system, and the result can be a type of synthetic telepathy. And they call it voice-to-skull technology. And he said that they have the ability to literally put your own voice in your head, or the voice of loved ones, and it can be telling you whatever they want. Now, it's up to us to listen to that voice, but still, that is kind of insane. And this breakaway civilization, this technocracy of mad scientists, they may well possess the power for mood manipulation, crowd influence, targeted neural disruption. They may have the ability to destabilize or calm whole populations through this ELF and other types of technology. I mean, really, a breakaway group would need this type of tech, because if you are running a secret civilization, in order to hide, you have to control geopolitics and huge populations of billions of people. Now, this one hits close to home for me, because I've heard voices in my head my entire life. And these voices have directed me, told me all kinds of things, minutes, hours, weeks to years before they happen. And in fact, 4 years ago, my entire awakening experience was for 2 years, 5 nights a week. A voice was speaking to me in my sleep. Now, there are many ways to describe these voices in my head, which I think everybody has to some degree. Mine would be more along the lines of a different part of myself speaking to myself, if that makes any sense. Sometimes a thought that is not connected to anything that I'm thinking at the time. Other times, it can be almost like some type of telepathic voice is talking to me in my sleep. But I would always describe it as internal audible voices. Never audible voices in the room or anything, just to make that clear. But there was a few times on this awakening journey that I actually wondered if this was somehow the military placing these thoughts or voices in my head. So what I did is I looked at the fruit in my life from listening to those voices and thoughts and impressions. And I found that they led me to be more open-minded, to let go of fear, and that aliens are real and reality is stranger than we can imagine. And that the only way to get through this time successfully is to be willing to face uncomfortable truths. And that's where Eric comes in, because he has now made it his mission to tell the world about what's really going on in Antarctica. He's gone to Washington, D.C. a couple times to share his story to the politicians. Of course, almost all of them have no idea what he's talking about, which is probably true. That's how these things work. He's also been on some of the biggest podcasts in the world. At least I think they are. Patrick Bet-David's podcast and Sean Ryan. But I think the best podcast appearance of Eric I've seen is on Dark Journalist podcasts. You can also go to Eric's website, Deciphering TV. He has all kinds of information, and he's trying to bring awareness to the world about direct energy weapons and how they use it against society. But Eric does have some advice for us, and that is the age-old saying, know thyself. In other words, we have to look into our own soul. Basically, we have to accept the fact that we are spiritual, and we can't ignore it. Because that Dr. Evil breakaway civilization can only remain as long as we choose to be ignorant. And I feel like humanity as a whole just really don't want to face our own spirituality. We want to save it for the pastor, or the guru, or the weirdo. But our only safety is turning within and knowing ourselves. And I guarantee you that this breakaway civilization will never recommend going within to get answers. So I imagine that any voices that they may want to put in our heads will always direct us to look externally. And they'll also be tied to fear. Because when we're afraid, we lose the ability to critically think. And when that happens, we are more easily controlled. That's why there's always something to be afraid of in the news stream. And that we need the government to come in and protect us and help. And this reminds me of someone 2,000 years ago who went around telling everybody that the kingdom is inside of us and to never give in to fear. And the government of his day had him killed and did everything they could to stomp out the fire that he started. Well, that seems to be a pattern, doesn't it? I mean, really, throughout all of human history, questioning the government could get you killed. But the good news is, things are starting to change. Eric is just one of many brave people who are speaking up. And one of the most prominent names to ever come forward and talk about this breakaway civilization and that we are not alone in the universe is former Canadian Defense Minister Paul Hellyer. He served from 1963 until 1967. But it wasn't until his later years when he became aware and fully convinced that we are not alone and that there is a breakaway civilization. It was the early 2000s, and Hellyer had read Philip J. Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. He said that when he read that book, it shook him to his core. So he then used his connections from his years as a politician to reach out to retired, high-ranking U.S. military officials. He told them he had read the book The Day After Roswell, and that the book had claimed the U.S. government had recovered crashed UFOs and reverse-engineered their technology. And he was told, that and more is true. And Paul dedicated the rest of his life to researching and trying to tell humanity what was really going on. So I'm going to end this episode by leaving you with a speech that Paul gave in 2013 in Washington, D.C. at a citizen hearing. It was a public event organized by UFO researchers and former members of U.S. Congress. And the reason why this is significant is because Paul is the only high-ranking G7 cabinet-level official to ever publicly claim that extraterrestrials are real, that governments have been contacted, advanced technology is being hidden, and a breakaway technocratic structure is running things behind the scenes. No other head of state from a G7 nation has ever publicly claimed the things you are about to hear Paul say.
The world is an unholy mess. They need the technology for clean energy. And it exists. And it's being kept secret by the same vested interests who control our destiny. Who are these vested interests, and what are they up to? I have broadened and deepened the definition to cabal, and the cabal comprises members of the Three Sisters, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, and the Trilateral Commission, the International Banking Cartel, the Oil Cartel, members of various intelligence organizations, and select members of the military junta, who together have become a shadow government of not only the United States, but of much of the Western world. The aim of the game is a world government comprising members of the cabal who are elected by no one and accountable to no one. And according to Mr. Rockefeller, the plan is well advanced. Young people everywhere need to be challenged by a noble cause. They need to be involved in arresting global warming, creating a banking system that is just and sustainable, and lead the way in the transformation to the new reality that we have to live in harmony with our celestial neighbors, as well as seeking peace on earth. In a word, we have to become spiritual beings and practice the one tenet that the world's major religions have in common, and that is